We were both in the 10th grade. She was the new girl, transferring into my school mid-year, and it felt like the whole place stopped when she walked into the classroom for the first time. Claire had this energy about her, cheerful, kind, and so effortlessly bright that you couldn't help but notice her. She wasn't just beautiful, she was magnetic. People were drawn to her, and I was no exception. She introduced herself with a big smile, her voice warm and friendly, and when our teacher asked her to sit next to me, my heart nearly stopped. At first, I was nervous around her. I mean, I was just an ordinary guy, average grades, average looks, nothing special. Claire, on the other hand, seemed like she was meant for something bigger. But she didn't act like she was better than anyone. She was the kind of person who made everyone feel like they mattered. Our friendship started slowly. She asked me questions during class, and we'd chat about little things, homework, teachers, what cafeteria food was worth eating. One day, our history teacher assigned us a project together, and that was when everything changed. The project was about the American Revolution, and I remember worrying that I'd mess it up and disappoint her. But Claire showed up at my house with a notebook full of ideas and a box of cookies she'd baked herself. "I thought we'd need snacks to get through this," she said with a laugh. We spent hours working on that project, but it didn't feel like work. We laughed at each other's terrible drawing skills, debated over the best way to present our findings, and ended up getting an A on the assignment. By the time it was over, I realized I didn't just like Claire, I liked her. Fast forward to the 11th grade. By then, we'd become close friends. We walked to class together, texted late into the night, and hung out on weekends. I thought about telling her how I felt, but I was terrified of ruining what we had. Then prom season came around, and everything changed. Our school had a tradition, juniors and seniors paired up to perform a waltz at prom. It was supposed to be this grand, elegant moment to kick off the evening. I was dreading it, I wasn't exactly graceful on my feet. But then Claire asked me to be her partner. Me? I blurted out, completely caught off guard. "Of course, you," she said with that radiant smile. "Who else would I want to dance with?" We started practicing after school. Her mom let us use their living room, moving the furniture out of the way so we had space. I was hopeless at first, stepping on her toes and tripping over my own feet. But Claire was patient. "It's not about being perfect," she told me. "It's about having fun." The night of prom was like something out of a dream. I'll never forget how Claire looked, her hair curled, her dress shimmering under the lights. She took my hand, and for a moment, it felt like the whole world had stopped. When the music started, I didn't think about the steps or the crowd watching us. All I could focus on was her. The way she smiled, the way she moved, the way she made me feel like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. At the end of the dance, as the crowd cheered, I knew I couldn't keep my feelings to myself any longer. I waited until we were outside, away from the noise and the lights, and finally told her how I felt. "I like you, Claire. More than a friend. A lot more." She looked at me, her eyes wide with surprise, and then she smiled, this soft, genuine smile that made my heart race. "I was hoping you'd say that," she said. And just like that, everything changed. We weren't just friends anymore. We were something more. Looking back, it feels like everything about that summer was perfect. After prom, when Claire and I admitted how we felt about each other, we became inseparable. It was like the world had finally fallen into place, and I couldn't imagine being happier. It started with small, everyday things, meeting up after school, holding hands for the first time, those awkward but sweet moments of figuring out how to navigate being more than just friends. Claire had this way of making everything feel effortless, though. She'd catch my eye during a conversation, flash that radiant smile, and suddenly, whatever I was worried about didn't seem to matter. As soon as summer break started, we had all the time in the world. It became our summer, the kind you see in movies or read about in books. We'd spend entire days together, talking about everything and nothing, dreaming about the future, and just enjoying each other's company. Most days started with Claire texting me bright and early. "Good morning. What's the plan today?" The plan usually involved something simple, but it never failed to feel special. We'd go for walks in the park, hang out at the diner on the corner that served the best milkshakes, or find new trails to explore. Claire loved adventure, even in the smallest things. One time, she decided we should try every flavor of ice cream at a local shop before the summer ended. "Even pistachio?" I asked, wrinkling my nose. "Especially pistachio," she laughed. "You might surprise yourself." Spoiler, I didn't like pistachio, but seeing Claire laugh at my reaction made it worth it. On weekends, we'd stay out late watching the stars. Claire was obsessed with constellations. She had this app on her phone that mapped the night sky, and she'd excitedly point out where Orion's Belt or the Big Dipper was. I barely remembered the names, but it didn't matter. Watching her light up as she talked was more than enough. We also made sure to spend time with each other's families. Claire's mom loved teasing me, saying I was the only person who could get Claire to sit still for more than 5 minutes. My parents adored Claire too, especially my mom, who always seemed to accidentally make extra dinner when she knew Claire was coming over. But as the days turned into weeks, a shadow loomed over our perfect summer. We both knew it couldn't last forever. Claire and I had been accepted to different universities in different cities. It was something we'd talked about even before prom, back when we were just friends, but now it felt like a much bigger deal. We'd be hours apart, in completely different worlds. The thought of saying goodbye was like this constant ache in the back of my mind. As the end of August approached, it became impossible to ignore. We tried to make the most of every moment, but there was always this unspoken tension. One night, as we were lying on the grass in the park, staring up at the stars, Claire finally said it out loud. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked, her voice quiet. I turned to look at her, the girl who had changed my life in ways I hadn't even realized yet. "Of course we are," I said, even though I wasn't entirely sure. "We'll figure it out." She nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "Promise?" "Promise," I said, squeezing her hand. The day we had to say goodbye came far too quickly. Claire was leaving first, heading to a city 3 hours away. I helped her load her bags into her mom's car, trying to keep it together, but my chest felt tight the whole time. When it was time for her to leave, she turned to me with tears in her eyes. "I'm going to miss you so much," she said, her voice breaking. "Me too," I said, pulling her into a hug. "But it's not goodbye." "Not really." I stood there as the car pulled away, waving until I couldn't see it anymore. 2 days later, it was my turn to leave. As I boarded the bus to my university, I kept thinking about that summer, all the little moments that had made it unforgettable. I didn't know what the future held, but I clung to the hope that we could make it work. After all, if anyone could, it was us. And just like that, our perfect summer ended, and we stepped into a new chapter, separately. Long-distance relationships are the stuff of romance movies, right? Two people madly in love, fighting against all odds to be together, counting down the days until they can finally reunite. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. That's what Claire and I thought we'd signed up for. But the truth? It was harder than either of us had imagined. At first, we were optimistic. We texted constantly, good morning messages, updates throughout the day, and late-night conversations until one of us inevitably fell asleep mid-text. Technology made the distance feel smaller, at least for a while. We sent pictures, shared memes, and even had virtual dates where we'd watch the same movie and text each other commentary. But there's something about not being able to hold someone's hand or see their smile in person that starts to wear on you after a while. Claire was 3 hours away, diving into university life with her usual enthusiasm. She joined clubs, made friends, and started volunteering with a local theater group. I was proud of her, but I couldn't help feeling a twinge of jealousy when she talked about all the new people in her life. I knew it was irrational. She was allowed to have a life outside of me, but the distance made it harder to silence those nagging insecurities. For me, things were a little different. My university was smaller, quieter. I threw myself into my studies and spent a lot of time alone. It wasn't exactly what I'd pictured when I left home, but I kept telling myself it was temporary. Claire and I had a plan: we'd survive these years apart, and then we'd build a life together. The hardest part was the weekends. Back in high school, Saturdays had been our days, lazy mornings, spontaneous adventures, and evenings spent watching the stars. Now, Saturdays were just another reminder of how far apart we were. We did everything we could to bridge the gap. Whenever we had a long weekend or a break from classes, one of us would make the trip. Sometimes Claire would take the train to my city, and I'd pick her up at the station, my heart racing as I scanned the crowd for her familiar face. Other times, I'd hop on a bus to her university, counting down the hours until I could see her. Those visits, no matter how short, made everything feel worth it. I remember one weekend in October when we hadn't seen each other in over a month. Claire called me on a Friday afternoon, her voice tinged with excitement. "I have a surprise for you," she said. "What kind of surprise?" I asked, already grinning. "Look outside." Confused, I walked to the window, and there she was, standing on the sidewalk with her overnight bag and that radiant smile I'd missed so much. I practically sprinted down the stairs to hug her. We only had 24 hours together that time, but it felt like a lifetime. We went to my favorite coffee shop, wandered through the campus gardens, and stayed up late talking about everything we'd been too busy to say during our usual phone calls. When she left the next day, I stood at the bus stop until her bus disappeared from view, already counting down the days until our next visit. But not every visit was so spontaneous. Sometimes, it felt like we were trying to orchestrate a military operation just to spend a few hours together. There were train delays, cancelled buses, and the ever-present stress of balancing schoolwork with travel plans. One time, I'd planned to surprise Claire by visiting her for her birthday. I booked a late-night bus, thinking I'd get there in time to meet her for breakfast the next morning. But halfway through the trip, the bus broke down on the side of the highway. We waited for hours for a replacement, and by the time I arrived at her university, it was nearly noon. When I finally saw her, standing outside her dorm with a birthday hat and a confused expression, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. "Happy birthday," I said sheepishly, holding up the slightly squished cake I'd carried all the way there. Claire just smiled and threw her arms around me. "You're here. That's all that matters." And that was the thing about us. No matter how difficult it got, we found a way to make it work. Even when we were apart, we made sure the other person felt loved. Claire sent me care packages filled with homemade cookies and little notes that said things like, "You've got this." I'd write her letters, the old-fashioned kind, and tuck Polaroids of us inside. But as much as we cherished those visits, they also made the goodbyes harder. I'd watch her board a train or bus, feeling like a part of me was leaving with her. The first time she cried as we said goodbye, I almost broke down too. "It's not forever," I reminded her, even as my own voice wavered. "We'll get through this." "I know," she said, wiping her tears and trying to smile. "But I wish we didn't have to." So did I. But for now, this was our reality, two people in love, doing whatever it took to hold on to each other across the miles. If you've ever been in a long-distance relationship, you know the emotional roller coaster it puts you through. For Claire and me, it was like running a marathon where the finish line kept moving. We loved each other, deeply, but the constant separation was taking its toll. After a few months, the initial excitement of visits and calls started to wear thin. We were trying so hard to make it work, but every goodbye felt heavier than the last. Our video calls were filled with laughter and updates, but once we hung up, I'd stare at the screen, wishing I could reach through it. Claire was thriving at her university. She'd joined a theater club and was always busy with classes and rehearsals. I loved hearing about her life, but part of me felt left behind. My own days were a blur of lectures, library visits, and eating alone in the dining hall. I tried to stay focused, reminding myself that this was temporary, but the ache of missing her made everything feel harder. We still made the effort. Whenever she had a big test or I had a presentation, we'd call to wish each other luck. If one of us was having a bad day, the other would drop everything to talk. On her birthday, I sent her a handwritten letter and a necklace I'd saved up for. She sent me a photo of herself wearing it, her smile so radiant it made my chest tighten. But even with all our efforts, cracks started to show. One night, after another long day of classes, I called Claire, hoping to hear her voice and forget about my frustrations. She sounded tired, distracted. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Yeah," she said, sighing. "Just a lot going on." "Do you want to talk about it?" "Not really. I think I just need some sleep." It wasn't like her to brush me off, and I couldn't help but take it personally. "Do you even want to talk to me anymore?" I blurted out. There was a long pause. "Of course I do," she said, her voice softer now. I hate this, Luke. I hate not being with you." Hearing that broke something in me. I hated it too. More than anything, I wanted to be there for her in person, not just as a voice on the other end of the line. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, thinking about how much better things had been when we were together. The distance wasn't just hard, it was making us doubt what we had. I didn't want that. The idea started as a whisper in the back of my mind, what if I just moved? At first, it seemed ridiculous. I was in the middle of my degree. Dropping out felt like giving up. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Claire and I had something special, something worth fighting for. What was the point of chasing a degree if I was miserable every day? I started looking into remote work, something that would let me support myself without being tied to one place. One weekend, I took the bus to visit Claire, and over dinner, I brought it up. "What if I moved here?" I asked, my heart pounding. She blinked at me, startled. "What?" "I'm serious," I said. "I can find a remote job, and we can get a place together. I hate being apart from you." For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she smiled, slowly at first, and then so brightly it felt like the room lit up. "You'd really do that?" "I'd do anything for you," I said, and I meant it. From that moment, everything moved quickly. I applied for remote jobs like a man possessed, spending every spare moment polishing my resume and sending out applications. Within a month, I landed a position doing customer support for a tech company. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well, and I could do it from anywhere. Dropping out of school wasn't an easy decision. My parents weren't thrilled when I told them, but they saw how determined I was. "If this is what you want, we'll support you," my mom said. The day I packed up my dorm room felt surreal. I said goodbye to my classmates, loaded my belongings into a rental car, and drove 3 hours to Claire's city. We spent the first week apartment hunting, and by some miracle, we found a small but cozy place near her campus. The rent was reasonable, and it had everything we needed: a tiny kitchen, a bedroom big enough for a double bed, and a little balcony where we could sit and watch the sunset. Moving in together was a whirlwind. We spent hours unpacking, deciding where to put the furniture, and arguing playfully over which posters to hang on the walls. By the time we were done, it didn't just feel like an apartment, it felt like home. For the first time in months, we didn't have to say goodbye at the end of the day. We could cook dinner together, watch movies on the couch, and fall asleep in each other's arms. One night, as we sat on the balcony sharing a bottle of cheap wine, Claire looked at me and said, "I can't believe you're here. It feels like a dream." "It's real," I said, taking her hand. We made it real. It wasn't perfect, of course. Adjusting to living together came with its challenges, but we faced them head-on. After all the distance, all the heartache, we finally had what we'd been fighting for. I thought we'd conquered the hardest part. Little did I know, the real challenges were still to come. Moving in with Claire was the kind of change I hadn't realized I needed. For months, we'd been living through phone screens and weekend visits, caught in this endless loop of goodbyes. Now, there were no more countdowns, no more parting hugs at the bus station. We were together, finally, and every day felt like a new beginning. The apartment was small, but it was ours. We didn't care that the kitchen only had enough counter space for one cutting board or that the shower head dripped no matter how tightly we turned it off. What mattered was that we were creating something together, a life we could share. At first, everything was exciting. We spent hours rearranging furniture, picking out thrift store decorations, and arguing over which shade of blue to paint the bathroom. Claire loved turning the apartment into a home, and I loved watching her do it. She had this way of making even the smallest spaces feel warm and inviting. We quickly fell into a routine. I worked from the tiny desk we'd squeezed into the corner of the living room, taking calls and responding to emails while Claire juggled her classes and theater rehearsals. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. Most days, she'd come home with stories about her professors or the latest drama in the theater club, and we'd sit at the kitchen table eating whatever dinner we'd managed to throw together, laughing about our day. But as much as we loved each other, living together wasn't always easy. There were moments when our differences showed in ways they hadn't before. Claire was a morning person. She'd wake up at the crack of dawn, humming to herself as she made coffee and opened the curtains. I, on the other hand, preferred to sleep in, and more than once, her chipper morning energy left me grumbling into my pillow. "I swear you're part rooster," I teased one morning as she danced around the kitchen, singing along to the radio. "And you're part bear," she shot back with a grin, handing me a mug of coffee. Then there was the toothpaste debacle. Claire liked to squeeze the tube from the middle, while I'd grown up in a house where squeezing from the bottom was practically a rule. It sounds silly now, but I remember standing in the bathroom one morning, staring at the mangled toothpaste tube and wondering how we'd ever survive sharing a home. But somehow, we did. We learned to navigate each other's quirks and find compromises. The toothpaste tube became 2 toothpaste tubes. Mornings became a mix of her cheerfulness and my grumpy gratitude for coffee. Through it all, our love only grew stronger. As Claire's graduation approached, I started thinking about the future. We'd built this life together, and I couldn't imagine it any other way. Every time I looked at her, whether she was rehearsing lines for a play or curled up on the couch with a book, I thought about how lucky I was to have her. One evening, as we were watching the sunset from our balcony, I decided to bring it up. "Do you ever think about what's next?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Claire tilted her head, her expression curious. "What do you mean? Like, after you graduate? What happens then?" She was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "I don't know. But as long as we're together, I'm not worried." That was all the encouragement I needed. A few weeks later, I started planning the proposal. I wanted it to be perfect, something she'd remember forever. After a lot of brainstorming, and a little help from her best friend, I decided to propose at the park where we'd spent so many of our early days together. The night before her graduation, I convinced her to take a walk with me. She thought we were just going for some fresh air, but I had other plans. As we reached the spot under the old oak tree where we used to sit and talk, I stopped and took her hand. "Do you remember the first time we came here?" I asked. She smiled, her eyes shining. Of course. You were so nervous, you could barely speak. And you made fun of me for tripping over my words, I said, laughing softly. But you still stayed. Before she could say anything, I got down on one knee and pulled out the ring. Claire, you've been my best friend, my partner, and the love of my life. I don't want to spend another day without you by my side. Will you marry me? Her hands flew to her mouth, and for a moment, I thought I'd surprised her into silence. Then she nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 times yes. The next day, she walked across the stage to get her diploma, and I sat in the audience, cheering louder than anyone else. We celebrated with her family and friends, but the whole time, I couldn't stop looking at her and thinking, she's going to be my wife. The months leading up to the wedding were a blur of planning, laughter, and more than a few arguments about table settings and seating charts. Claire wanted everything to be perfect, and I just wanted her to be happy. The wedding itself was everything we'd dreamed of. It was a small ceremony in a garden, with just our closest friends and family. Claire walked down the aisle in a simple white dress, her hair crowned with flowers, and I thought my heart might burst. When we said our vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. From the moment I met Claire, I'd known she was special. But standing there, holding her hands and promising to love her for the rest of my life, I realized just how lucky I was. We danced our first dance as husband and wife under the stars, surrounded by the people who loved us most. And as I held her close, I thought about everything we'd been through, the distance, the challenges, the laughter and tears, and how it had all led to this moment. We were finally home. Together. Forever. If I had to describe the first few years of our marriage in one word, it would be adventurous. Life with Claire was never dull. She had this way of turning even the smallest moments into something magical, and together, we built a life that felt more like a dream than reality. After the wedding, we moved back into our cozy apartment, but things felt different now. We weren't just a couple figuring things out anymore, we were partners, teammates, a family. My online job had grown into a steady source of income, and before long, I was earning more than I'd ever thought possible. It was enough to cover our expenses and then some, which meant Claire didn't need to rush into a job after graduation. At first, she wasn't sure what to do with her newfound free time. I can't just sit around all day while you're working, she said one morning, leaning against the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee. I wouldn't mind if you did, I teased. You've earned it after all those years of studying. But that wasn't Claire's style. She started volunteering at a local animal shelter, spending her mornings helping out with the dogs and cats. I'd come home from work to hear stories about the mischievous puppy who'd stolen her shoe or the shy kitten that finally came out of hiding. Do you think we could adopt one? She asked one evening, her eyes sparkling as she showed me a picture of a scruffy little mutt named Max. How could I say no to that face? I replied, pretending to be stern but already melting. Max became the third member of our little family, and he brought even more joy into our lives. He was a bundle of energy, always chasing his tail or dragging his toys into our laps. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. Watching Claire with him, laughing as he tried to climb onto her lap even though he was far too big, made me realize just how lucky I was. As time went on, Claire started exploring other ways to spend her time. She had a soft spot for helping others, so it wasn't long before she got involved in charity work. She volunteered at food drives, organized fundraisers, and even helped run events for local schools. One year, she got involved with a program that organized care packages for deployed soldiers. Our apartment turned into a makeshift assembly line, with boxes of snacks, toiletries, and handwritten letters taking over every available surface. Are you sure we don't need the couch? I joked as I navigated around the piles of supplies. It's for a good cause, she said, grinning as she taped up another box. Seeing her so passionate about helping others made me love her even more. Claire had this incredible ability to make people feel seen and cared for, and I admired that about her every day. But it wasn't all work and no play. We made a point to fill our lives with as much adventure and excitement as we could. Traveling became one of our favorite things to do. With my remote job giving me the flexibility to work from anywhere, we started planning trips to places we'd always dreamed of visiting. Our first big trip was to the mountains. Claire had never been skiing before, and she was determined to learn. It took her about 5 minutes to realize it wasn't as easy as it looked. "Why didn't anyone warn me this was just sliding downhill on sticks?" she groaned after her third fall. "Because it's hilarious to watch," I said, earning a playful snowball to the face. By the end of the trip, she wasn't exactly Olympic level, but she'd mastered the bunny slope and was already planning our next winter adventure. The following summer, we rented a camper van and took a road trip across the country. We stopped at national parks, quirky roadside attractions, and tiny diners with the best pie we'd ever tasted. Every day was a new adventure, and every night, we'd sit under the stars, talking about everything and nothing. One evening, as we watched the sunset from a cliff overlooking the ocean, Claire turned to me and said, "This is what life's all about, isn't it? Just being together, making memories." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words. It really is. Our travels weren't always grand. Some of our favorite adventures were the simpler ones, day trips to nearby towns, picnics in the park, or spontaneous drives with no destination in mind. We made a habit of trying new things together, whether it was taking a cooking class, learning how to salsa dance, or attempting, and failing, to build a bookshelf from scratch. Claire had a knack for turning even the most mundane activities into something fun and memorable. "Why do we always end up covered in paint?" I asked one afternoon as we attempted to redecorate the bedroom. "Because we're overachievers," she replied, laughing as she swiped a streak of blue across my nose. Through it all, we never stopped appreciating the little things. Cooking dinner together, walking Max around the neighborhood, or just sitting on the couch watching old movies, it was the everyday moments that reminded me why I fell in love with Claire in the first place. Life was full of emotions, laughter, and love. It wasn't always perfect, no life ever is, but it was ours, and it was everything I could have hoped for. At the time, I thought we were unstoppable. We'd built a life filled with joy and meaning, and I couldn't imagine anything that could shake us. But life, as I would soon learn, has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. Life had a way of surprising me, and sometimes, those surprises came wrapped in glittery holiday bows. It was the start of December, and Claire and I were getting into the Christmas spirit. Our little apartment was decked out with twinkling lights, a tiny tree that Max couldn't stop sniffing, and stockings hung by the heater because we didn't have a fireplace. Claire adored Christmas. She went all out every year, baking cookies, singing carols off-key, and insisting we watch Home Alone at least 3 times before the big day. For her, the holidays were about giving back, so when an opportunity came up for her to do just that, she jumped at it. It all started with a call from one of her friends who worked with a local charity. They were organizing a Christmas fair in the park, complete with a Santa Claus booth where kids could come to share their wishes and receive little gifts. "They need an assistant for Santa," Claire told me one evening, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Someone to help with the kids, hand out presents, and keep the line moving." "Isn't that perfect?" "It does sound like it's right up your alley," I said, smiling at how animated she'd become. "But are you sure you want to commit to something so time-consuming? You've already got a full plate with all your other charity work." Claire waved off my concerns. "It's only for a month, and it'll be so much fun. Plus, it's for the kids." How could I say no? She called her friend back that night to accept the position, and by the next morning, she was officially Santa's assistant. The fair was set to open the following weekend, and Claire spent the next few days preparing. She couldn't stop talking about it, how the booth would be decorated, the little gifts they'd be handing out, and how adorable the kids would be in their Christmas sweaters. "I even get a costume," she said one evening, holding up a red and white outfit complete with a fur-trimmed cape and matching hat. She twirled around, the cape billowing out behind her. "What do you think?" "I think Santa's never had a better helper," I said, laughing. When the fair opened that Saturday, I insisted on driving Claire to her first day. The park was a bustling scene of holiday cheer, twinkling lights strung between the trees, the scent of hot cocoa and roasted chestnuts filling the air, and children laughing as they ran from one booth to the next. Claire's booth was right in the center of it all, a big red tent decorated with candy canes, snowflakes, and a giant sign that read Santa's Workshop. Inside, a jolly man in a Santa suit sat on a throne-like chair, ready to greet the kids. I helped Claire carry in her supplies, staying just long enough to see her get into the swing of things. She was in her element, smiling and chatting with the kids as she handed them their gifts. That first day, I picked her up after her shift, eager to hear all about it. "It was amazing," she said as soon as she got in the car. "The kids were so sweet, and Santa is hilarious. He kept cracking jokes about how I should get Max a matching Christmas sweater." "Sounds like you're having a blast," I said, glad to see her so happy. For the next 4 days, I continued driving her to and from the fair. I'd drop her off in the morning, stick around long enough to grab a coffee from one of the nearby stalls, and pick her up in the evening. It wasn't that I didn't trust her, I just liked seeing her so excited about something she cared about. Claire would come home every night full of stories about the kids, the parents, and the general chaos of the Christmas season. One little boy asked Santa for a puppy, she told me one night, her face lighting up. And when Santa said he'd try his best, the boy said, "If you can't, a kitten's okay too." Isn't that the sweetest? It was hard not to smile when she talked like that. Her joy was infectious, and I loved seeing her so passionate about something. By the 5th day, I felt like I'd seen enough to know she was in good hands. The fair was well organized, the people running it were friendly, and Claire seemed genuinely happy. So, I told her I'd stop tagging along. "You sure you're okay with that?" she asked as we ate dinner that evening. "Of course," I said. "I trust you. Besides, I've got a ton of work to catch up on." She kissed me on the cheek, smiling. "Thanks for being so supportive. It means a lot." From then on, Claire drove herself to the fair. I didn't think much of it at the time, it was just another example of how independent and capable she was. Every night, she'd come home with more stories, her cheeks pink from the cold and her eyes shining with excitement. But as the days went on, something began to shift. She started coming home later than usual, brushing it off with explanations about long lines and last-minute cleanups. "You know how it is," she'd say, laughing it off. "Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. It's Christmas. Everyone's in a rush." At first, I didn't think much of it. Claire was always the type to go above and beyond, especially when it came to helping others. But as the weeks went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I told myself I was overthinking it. After all, what could possibly be wrong? This was Claire, my cheerful, kind, and loving wife. And yet, the nagging doubt lingered, growing stronger with each passing day. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. Claire was coming home a little later than usual after her shifts at the fair, but I didn't think much of it. The holidays were hectic for everyone, and from what I'd seen during those first few days, the fair was a madhouse. Kids lining up for hours to see Santa, parents juggling shopping bags and squirming toddlers, volunteers rushing to keep everything running smoothly. It was easy to imagine things not wrapping up on time. "Long day?" I asked one evening as she walked through the door, her cheeks pink from the cold. "You have no idea," she said, dropping her bag on the floor and flopping onto the couch. One little girl wouldn't stop crying because Santa ran out of her favorite candy, and then another kid tried to eat a fake snowflake. It's chaos. She laughed as she told me the story, and I couldn't help but smile. This was Claire, always finding the humor in everything. But as the days went on, her late nights became more frequent. She'd come home after dark, her excuses always the same: the lines were crazy tonight, or, we had to clean up the tent because someone spilled hot cocoa everywhere. I wanted to believe her. I did believe her. Claire wasn't just my wife, she was my best friend, the person I trusted most in the world. If she said the fair was keeping her late, why wouldn't I take her at her word? Still, I couldn't help but notice that something felt different. She started to withdraw, little by little. It wasn't obvious at first, just small things, like how she'd be quieter during dinner or how she'd disappear into the bedroom as soon as she got home, saying she was too tired to stay up. "Are you okay?" I asked one night as we sat on the couch, Max curled up between us. "Of course," she said, giving me a tired smile. "Just busy, that's all." Her words seemed genuine, but there was a distance in her eyes that hadn't been there before. I told myself it was just the holiday stress. Between her work at the fair and all the other charity events she was involved in, it made sense that she'd be worn out. But as the weeks went on, that distance only grew. Claire, who used to fill our home with laughter and conversation, now seemed distracted, her mind always somewhere else. I'd catch her staring off into space during dinner or scrolling through her phone late at night, her face illuminated by the screen. "Everything okay?" I asked one evening as I watched her type out a message, her fingers moving quickly. "Yeah, just texting a friend from the fair," she said without looking up. Her responses were always so casual, so nonchalant, that I felt ridiculous for even questioning her. What reason did I have to doubt her? And yet, the nagging feeling in the back of my mind refused to go away. It didn't help that her stories about the fair became more vague as time went on. Where she used to come home bursting with tales about the kids and Santa, she now gave short, clipped answers when I asked how her day had been. "Busy," she'd say, or, "Same as always." I started to blame it on the nature of the work. Dealing with kids all day, especially during the holiday season, was bound to be exhausting. Maybe she just didn't have the energy to talk about it anymore. "You're doing so much good," I told her one evening as we sat down for dinner. "Those kids are lucky to have someone like you." She gave me a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thanks," she said, and then quickly changed the subject. It wasn't like her to brush off a compliment, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd said something wrong. But then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her fingers warm against mine. "I appreciate you," she said softly. "For always supporting me." Her words melted away my doubts, if only for a little while. This was Claire, after all, the same woman who'd turned our tiny apartment into a home, who'd spent hours baking cookies for the neighbors, who'd danced with me under the stars on our wedding night. She'd never given me a reason not to trust her. And so, I pushed my worries aside. Every time she came home late, I told myself it was because of the kids, the cleanup, the endless holiday chaos. I reminded myself that this was the busiest time of year for everyone, and that things would settle down once Christmas was over. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One night, as I lay in bed waiting for Claire to come home, I found myself staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. Was I being paranoid? Or was there something more to her late nights than she was letting on? When she finally walked through the door, I pretended to be asleep. I heard her move quietly through the apartment, her footsteps soft against the floor. She didn't come straight to bed like she usually did. Instead, I heard her in the living room, her voice low as she spoke to someone on the phone. "Yeah," she whispered. "I'll see you tomorrow." I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself not to overthink it. She was probably just talking to one of her friends from the fair. There was no reason to jump to conclusions. But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder, why did it feel like the woman I'd loved for so long was suddenly slipping away from me? Things between Claire and me had been tense for weeks. The late nights, her distant behavior, the vague explanations, it all added up to a storm brewing just beneath the surface. I kept telling myself it was the stress of the holidays, the chaos of the fair, and the countless kids needing attention. But deep down, that nagging doubt was growing harder to ignore. One evening, after another late night that turned into a strained argument, everything came to a head. She walked through the door at almost 10 p.m., her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly disheveled. Max wagged his tail excitedly as she set her bag down, but I didn't move from the couch. "You're late again," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I know," she replied, avoiding my gaze. "I told you, the fair's been crazy lately." "Crazy every night?" I asked, the edge in my voice sharper than I intended. "You've been late almost every day this week, Claire. Do you know how worried I've been? You don't answer my texts, and I don't know if something's happened to you." She sighed, brushing a hand through her hair. "I told you, Luke. It's just the holidays. The lines are long, the cleanup takes forever." "Then why does it feel like there's more to it than that?" I cut in, standing up. She froze, her shoulders tense. For a moment, the only sound in the room was Max's tail thumping against the floor. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Claire," I said quietly. "If something's wrong, just tell me. I don't want to keep fighting like this. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference." She turned to me then, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read, fear, guilt, maybe even sadness. And then she said it. "I'm pregnant." The words hit me like a freight train. "Pregnant?" I stared at her, my mind racing to catch up. You're pregnant?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes. I found out last week, but I didn't know how to tell you." A wave of emotions crashed over me, shock, confusion, a flicker of joy, and then doubt. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. But that nagging feeling in the back of my mind wouldn't go away. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I was scared," she admitted, wiping at her eyes. "I didn't know how you'd react, and with everything going on at the fair." I took a deep breath, trying to process what she was saying. This was big, huge. A baby changed everything. For a moment, the arguments and doubts faded into the background. This was Claire, the woman I'd loved for years. She was carrying our child. "I'm happy," I said finally, though the words felt fragile, like glass ready to shatter. "I just wish you'd told me sooner." She smiled weakly, stepping closer to hug me. I held her, trying to push the doubts aside, but they lingered like a shadow at the edge of my thoughts. The next day, I decided to drive to the fair and pick her up myself. I wanted to surprise her, to show her that I was committed to supporting her and the baby. Maybe if I saw her in her element, surrounded by the holiday chaos she described, my doubts would disappear. I waited until late in the evening, around the time her shifts usually ended. The park was quiet when I arrived, the festive lights still twinkling but the crowds long gone. As I parked near the fairgrounds, I noticed something strange. The area around Santa's booth was completely empty. The big red tent, which had been the centerpiece of the fair, was still lit up, its glow cutting through the darkness. But there was no sign of Claire, the other volunteers, or the cheerful bustle I'd expected. I got out of the car, my breath fogging in the cold night air, and made my way toward the tent. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of confusion and unease taking hold. Maybe they'd wrapped up early, I told myself. Maybe she'd already left and was on her way home. But then why was the light still on? As I approached the tent, I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" No response. The only sound was the crunch of snow beneath my boots. I reached the entrance and hesitated for a moment before pulling back the flap. Inside, the glow of the fairy lights illuminated the familiar setup, the chair where Santa sat, the pile of wrapped gifts, the scattered decorations. But it wasn't empty. My breath caught in my throat as I took in the scene before me. Claire was there, but she wasn't alone. She was standing in the middle of the tent, her back to me. Her red and white costume was disheveled, the cape hanging loosely from her shoulders. Across from her stood the man who played Santa, his hat askew and his shirt unbuttoned. It took me a moment to register what I was seeing. Claire's dress was half undone, slipping down her shoulders, and the man, Santa, had his pants around his ankles. For a second, it felt like the world had stopped. My mind couldn't process it. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. "Claire," I said, my voice breaking. She spun around, her face pale with shock. The man froze, his expression a mix of fear and guilt. I didn't wait for an explanation. I turned and walked out of the tent, my heart pounding and my vision blurred by tears. The cold air hit me like a slap, but it did nothing to numb the pain tearing through my chest. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the steering wheel and trying to breathe. I didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal, the lies, or the fact that I'd let myself believe everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. That night, as I drove home, one thought kept replaying in my mind: how could she do this to me? The drive home felt endless. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, and my mind raced with questions I didn't want to ask. The image of Claire in that tent, half-dressed with the man playing Santa, was burned into my memory. No matter how much I blinked, I couldn't make it go away. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I wasn't angry anymore, I was numb. I sat in the car for a few minutes, staring at the front door of the apartment we'd called home for years. The lights were off, the windows dark. It looked peaceful from the outside, but inside, I knew everything had changed. I couldn't wait for Claire to come home and explain herself. I didn't want to hear excuses or apologies or lies. Instead, I walked inside, grabbed a suitcase from the closet, and began packing her things. At first, my movements were slow and deliberate, as if I were in a trance. I pulled her clothes from the dresser, folding them neatly even though my hands trembled. Her favorite sweater, the one she always wore on chilly mornings, felt heavier in my hands than it should have. As I packed, memories flooded back: our first morning in this apartment, cooking breakfast together and burning the toast, the time we painted the walls and ended up covered in more paint than the walls themselves, the night we danced in the living room, Max barking at our feet. Each memory felt like a knife twisting in my chest. How could someone I loved so deeply, someone I'd built a life with, betray me like this? By the time I reached the bathroom to grab her toiletries, the sadness was overtaken by anger. I wasn't just hurt, I was furious. Furious at her for lying, for breaking my trust, for making me feel like a fool. But most of all, I was furious at myself. I'd seen the signs. The late nights, the distance, the secrecy, I'd ignored them all because I didn't want to believe the truth. I'd convinced myself that Claire could never do something like this. Now, as I packed up the last of her belongings, I realized how wrong I'd been. I was dragging the suitcase into the hallway when I heard the front door open. Claire stepped inside, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw me. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't answer right away. I just stared at her, searching for some hint of the woman I thought I knew. But all I could see was the Claire from the tent, the one who'd shattered everything we'd built together. I'm packing your things, I said finally, my voice cold and flat. Her eyes darted to the suitcase, then back to me. Luke, wait. Please, let me explain. There's nothing to explain, I cut her off, my anger bubbling to the surface. I saw you, Claire. I saw what you were doing with him. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't let myself feel pity. Not this time. It's not what you think, she said, stepping closer. I swear, it's not. Don't, I snapped, taking a step back. Don't insult me by lying again. Just take your things and go. She shook her head, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. I can't go, Luke. I can't leave because I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, I couldn't speak. That doesn't change what I saw, I said, though my voice wavered. You think saying you're pregnant is going to make this okay? After everything. It's your baby, she interrupted, her voice rising. You're the father, Luke. I swear on everything, you're the father. I froze, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a tidal wave. How can I believe anything you say? I asked quietly. How can I trust you after what I saw tonight? She took another step closer, her eyes desperate. Because it's the truth. You've always trusted me before. Don't let one mistake ruin everything we've built. One mistake? I repeated, my voice filled with disbelief. Claire, you cheated on me. You betrayed me. That's not just a mistake. I know I messed up, she said, her voice cracking. But please, Luke, think about what's at stake. Think about our baby. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. A baby. Our baby. If she was telling the truth, this wasn't just about the two of us anymore. There was someone else to consider, someone innocent in all of this. I stared at her, my mind a whirlwind of anger, doubt, and confusion. Every part of me wanted to tell her to leave, to walk out that door and never come back. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way she looked at me, pleading and broken. Maybe it was the tiny flicker of hope that she might be telling the truth. Or maybe it was the thought of the baby, a child who didn't ask to be brought into this mess. Fine, I said finally, my voice heavy with exhaustion. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. But don't think for a second that I've forgiven you. Her shoulders sagged with relief, and she stepped forward as if to hug me, but I held up a hand to stop her. We're doing this for the baby, I said firmly. Not because I trust you. Not because I believe you. But because that child deserves a chance. Claire nodded, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, Luke. I swear. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and walked into the bedroom, leaving her standing alone in the hallway. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. The months that followed Claire's revelation were some of the most difficult of my life. The trust between us was shattered, hanging by the thinnest of threads, and every interaction felt strained, like we were walking on eggshells. Despite my reservations, I stayed. Not for Claire, but for the baby she swore was mine. The pregnancy was a whirlwind of appointments, baby names, and preparation. I tried my best to be supportive, but there was always a shadow hanging over me, the memory of that night at the tent, the doubts that gnawed at me every time I looked at her. Claire, for her part, seemed determined to make things right. She threw herself into preparing for the baby, painting the nursery, reading parenting books, and making endless lists of things we'd need. She tried to act like everything was normal, like we were a happy couple excited to become parents. But no matter how hard she tried, I couldn't shake the doubts. As her due date approached, I found myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if the child she was carrying was really mine. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to be the kind of man who could put the past behind him and trust his wife. But the image of Claire and that man in the tent haunted me, and the whispers of doubt grew louder with each passing day. When the baby was born, I felt a mix of emotions I wasn't prepared for. Holding that tiny, fragile life in my arms should have been a moment of pure joy. Instead, I felt a knot of uncertainty tightening in my chest. The baby had Claire's eyes, her soft features, her delicate hands. But as I looked closer, I couldn't see any trace of myself. No resemblance, no connection that made me feel like this child was truly mine. The doubts that had been simmering for months boiled over. I had to know the truth. One night, a week after we brought the baby home, Claire fell asleep on the couch after another long day of feedings and diaper changes. I watched her for a moment, torn between guilt and resolve, before quietly getting up and retrieving the baby's bottle. It wasn't difficult to collect a sample. A stray strand of Claire's hair from her hairbrush, a tiny swab from the baby's cheek while I fed them, it was all over in minutes. My hands shook as I sealed the envelope and addressed it to the paternity test lab I'd researched online. For the next week, I lived in limbo. I went through the motions of daily life, holding the baby, helping Claire, and pretending everything was fine. But inside, I felt like I was suffocating. When the results finally arrived, I opened the email with trembling hands. My heart pounded as I scrolled through the report, searching for the answer that would change everything. And there it was, in cold, clinical text: the probability of paternity is less than 1%. I stared at the screen, my mind reeling. Less than 1%. The child I'd been holding, caring for, and trying to bond with, it wasn't mine. The betrayal I'd tried to push aside came rushing back, sharper and more painful than ever. That night, I confronted Claire. "Claire," I said, my voice tight with anger. She looked up from the baby, her expression curious but wary. "What's wrong?" she asked. I took a deep breath, holding up my phone with the test results displayed. "Care to explain this?" Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she said nothing. Then she shook her head, her voice trembling. "Luke, I don't understand. That has to be a mistake. Don't lie to me." I snapped, my voice rising. "The test doesn't lie, Claire. You said this baby was mine. You swore it." I thought it was," she stammered, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean." "You didn't mean to lie to me? To trap me into raising another man's child?" I interrupted, my voice shaking with rage. "I didn't know," she cried, clutching the baby to her chest. "I thought it was yours, Luke. I swear I did." I turned away, running a hand through my hair as I tried to process everything. The woman I'd loved for years, the life we'd built together, the baby I'd tried so hard to accept, it was all a lie. "I want you out," I said finally, my voice cold and firm. "What?" Claire whispered, her face crumpling. "I want you out of this house," I repeated, turning to face her. "Take your things, take the baby, and leave. I'm done, Claire. I can't do this anymore." "Please, Luke," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Don't do this. We can fix this." "There's nothing to fix," I said sharply. "You broke everything. You lied to me, Claire. You lied about the most important thing in the world." I walked into the bedroom, grabbed the small suitcase I'd packed months ago, and handed it to her. Then I pulled out a few $1,000s in cash from the safe and set it on the table. "This should be enough to get you somewhere temporary," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. Claire sobbed, clutching the baby as she looked at me one last time. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." I didn't respond. I just opened the door and waited for her to leave. When the door finally closed behind her, I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands. The apartment felt empty without her, but for the first time in months, I could breathe. The life I thought I'd had was over, but at least now, I knew the truth. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference.